Hello, this is Pixel Freak, and we're doing part 29 of the Final Fantasy Dimensions walkthrough. So if you are watching this part without watching the before this, I still have a cold, so I sound a little funny, I might be kind of squeaky. And this piece is actually half an hour long, so most definitely will be going on to some sort of digression at some point, and I am almost definitely going to be coughing a little bit here and there. So I'm just getting over a cold, but I'm in that really cool part where everything's really gross and slimy, and I can't talk very well. So you return back to Rusalka, and really all you have on your plate is to go take the bottle that you picked up in the woods and go jump into the whirlpool, and yeah, that's it. I mean, you're going to go into the underwater fortress, or whatever it's called, and clean it out. This is the main piece of this part of the story. So this is a longer dungeon, a lot like the piece with Asmodai that was just a few parts back. This is one of the kind of elemental temples. If you haven't noticed, that's the way they've been doing this. They've been playing the game as there's the four generals for the Empire, and I think that they're kind of representing the elements, as Final Fantasy typically does. There's also kind of these elemental temples. This is kind of water temple. I wouldn't necessarily say they keep the temples to like the four elements, though. I think the temples just it's kind of elementally themed. So throughout this dungeon, it would make a lot of sense to have a black mage or somebody that can cast black magic using quite a bit of lightning. Or I guess it's thunder. Because between thunder and lightning, thunder's the dangerous part, right? That's the part that is highly conductive with water. I always thought that was a funny mechanic. And I'm not sure if I've mentioned that in another piece of this walkthrough or not. It's an interesting thing that Final Fantasy's always said thunder was the spell, when thunder is typically a noise. Thunder's always a noise. It's the lightning that you gotta be scared of, especially if you're wet. I guess though, if it was powerful enough, right? Because if you could do like a sonic boom. So if you're Guile from Street Fighter, in that case, thunder's very powerful. But nonetheless, I just caught myself walking around with poison on my guy. I've cut out quite a few of the fights in this. I think I was leaving in 1 out of 3 is what I decided to leave in. So rather than analyze each fight and say, oh, this is a good fight, I should keep this one in there, or I should throw this one out, I just said 1 out of every 3 fights I left in, and that doesn't count the boss and the mini-boss fights. I just left all them in. But yeah, so it's interesting that Thunder's always the name of the spell, almost always the name of the spell in Final Fantasy games. So you'll run into a few of these guys here. Very much like the... man, I wish I could think of the name of the kind of forest temple. Yggdrasil, that's what it was. It was Yggdrasil. I love it when it just comes to me. In Yggdrasil, they had these kind of sub-bosses too. In this game, or in this temple, it's the same thing. You're going against these lady women. Whole lot of confused going on. If you've watched the part previous to this, I was just talking about how the game seems to be ramping up its use of confuse. Confuse is always a tough one to shake as well. There is a spell that the white mages get to cure it, but it's almost always more effective to just, especially have one of your lower attacking allies just hit your guy that's confused. So like maybe a black mage or a white mage. Luckily for me, in this party, I've got 3 guys that can't hit worth a damn, so I got 3 opportunities. Not sure. I did a lot of backtracking in this particular video, and I didn't go anywhere. I think I was playing through it, and I kept thinking that I missed something, and so I'd keep doubling back. Must have been in a funny mood, and I was just questioning myself the whole time. Maybe it was that treasure box that threw me off. And I did do a little bit of backtracking. I think I missed the treasure box early on and went back for it. The original footage on this video was something like 45 minutes. So I would expect this entire dungeon to take you about 40 minutes. Even though this video, I think, is something under 30. Part of it is removing all those fights, too. Which, even though there's a lot of those fights, they don't take that much time. Each fight's probably, I don't know, 20 seconds, something like that. So when you cut them out, you know, even cutting out a ton of them, it doesn't add up to much. Yggdrasil was the same way, where there was a ton of footage, and then when I edited it down, it wasn't that big. A lot of it is just the backtracking piece. If you can figure out how not to backtrack, or watch these videos, so you know not where to get everything and not have to backtrack, the dungeons are much faster, much easier on your group too. Things like mana pools, much easier to keep up. So maybe I was wrong. Soul hit himself for 369. It was either in this video or the last video that I mentioned that in this game, Confuse makes it so your guys don't hit themselves as hard. But I think that was full damage. I think. Let's see. Let's see till he hits somebody else. Because I was just playing earlier today. I was playing recording another piece to this, and one of my guys hit his teammate and hit him for very little damage compared to what he normally hits, I should say. Well, I guess the world may never know. And don't forget, because your team's kind of on that borderline now, you might have to use 2 tents. You might not have cottages, and if your mana pools are low enough, you'll need to use 2 tents in order to get those mana pools all the way up. And the funny thing in this video too, even though it's a half an hour long, I think I run into the boss at like 15 minutes in, so not that much farther from here, another 6 minutes or so, and I run into the boss. So the boss is actually a long sequence. There's a lot of little story elements that go on there, and then it transitions into the next iteration of Noct and his team. That's kind of funny. I say that Noct is the lead character on that side and that Soul is the lead character on this side, but that hasn't been That hasn't been entirely reinforced. I mean, they very subtly reinforce that. Which I kind of like that. You know, I like that it's not... They're not necessarily the leaders of the groups. They don't come off as the leaders of the groups. But you started playing as them, like Soul, for instance. He was the first character that you controlled. It's kind of like in Final Fantasy VI, when you start the game out, you're Terra. And the game kind of makes you think that Terra is the lead character of the game, because you're kind of following her for about the first half of the game. Then when the World of Ruin comes up, they put you in charge with, or they give you Celeste, which is interesting because I think what they were trying to say with Final Fantasy III was that there really wasn't a lead character. I mean, everybody had their own stories, and if you did all the optional quests, there was a lot of deeper plot lines that happened with each character. And Terra's included. I mean, Terra has a pretty major one, but there were other characters that had very major plot lines as well. I thought it was really interesting that they did that, because I think they were trying to show that even though that Terra kind of was at the front of the characters in the World of Light, once you've gathered them all and once you are assembled, it's really a story about the returners. It's really a story about them as an aggregate, them as an entire group, not just one person. And the ending played that same thing out. So in this piece, real quick, I gotta mention, you have to pick up these 3 candles and bring them to the top. I do it out of order because I did this one without running through the temple first once. So just grab one of the candles, run to the top, then grab the next one and run to the top, and then grab the 3rd candle and run to the top. Anyway, so it's interesting though in Final Fantasy VI when you beat the game, the ending, and there's no real spoilers here, but it kind of goes character by character and gives you almost individual endings for all the characters. It kind of tells you how everybody ended up. And I think that kind of goes back to the whole idea they were trying to push, that it wasn't a story about one of the characters and his associates. You know, it was a story about all of them and how the events that happened throughout the game impacted each one of them individually and as a whole. So I can't necessarily say that's what they're doing here, because I don't think that this game doesn't have as much attention to detail like that put into the story as, say, those games. It seemed as though with those games they were really trying to do something unique, and they were really trying to tell a very deep story. In this game, it seemed like what they were trying to do was put a story together that was reminiscent of the old stories. Does it feel like Final Fantasy IV and like Final Fantasy VI? Oh, it does? Okay, that's good. And does it feel like 3? Does it feel like 1? And it does. It kind of feels like all those games. You put them all together, and this kind of feels like that. But with that, I kind of feel like the storytelling and just the story in general in this game, it doesn't feel original. It doesn't feel authentic at all. It doesn't feel... it's not the same. It's not the same, I care a little bit about the characters in this game, but not like I did with those characters back in the day. It's tough, though, because, you know, I'm now in my early 30s, right? And so, because I'm kind of old. But when I play games now, I have a different mindset than when I played games when I was a kid. You know, when you're a kid, everything is awesome. And I mean, this is a really good example is, go watch some movies that you loved when you were a kid. But make sure that you're okay with ruining a little piece of your childhood, because some of the movies that you watched as a kid that you just remember being so awesome are not that awesome. In fact, some of them are just going to downright suck. Really, really bad. And for that reason, with nostalgia and video games, you have to be very careful about what you go back and play, because there are some games that you'll remember as being very good, but maybe they were only okay, or maybe they were bad. The Final Fantasy games, we do know that they've, you know, held the test of time, and they're still really good games, but maybe we hold them in our memories as being much better games than they were just kind of that nostalgic, you know, capture. Only because as kids, or as at least younger people, we weren't as in tune with what truly was good. So it's interesting because you're always going to have that inner battle, you know, and because you can only see things from one perspective, really, and your perspective has changed over time, it's tough to be able to make an objective judgment call about that. To say, oh yeah, well, Final Fantasy VI is great today, because we don't know if Final Fantasy VI is great today, because we would have had to play it for the first time now in order to make that call. I guess you could say people that play it for the first time when they're a little bit older still like it. But that hasn't been my experience. You also have the problem there of people that are playing it for the first time now have probably played a lot of other games, you know, Skyrim and Final Fantasy games of late. And the perspective is different, because in Final Fantasy VI, that was very cutting edge, and it's not anymore. I mean, that holds up. There's a lot of games right now, especially on mobile devices, that are doing the same kind of graphic styles, but it's not the same as what people are used to. So here we are, about 16 and a half minutes, and this is going to cue up the final boss fight here. So the nice thing about this particular boss is this is not as bad as Asmodai. Asmodai was actually, he was pretty rough. My guys, I thought were a pretty high level, and I had a little bit of trouble. You know, I didn't lose or anything, but he did some damage. This guy is not quite so bad. There's a lot of damage output, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to manage your team to beat him. I guess it's a her. It's a caster. One of the great things too, if I remember correctly, her HP pool is not too high, not ridiculously high, so you don't have to keep this up forever. You can see I've got a pretty good groove here. I have a really good auto battle, but I'm just keeping it going. Oh, I forgot about Toad. So she does cast Toad. Be ready for that. Either have some Maiden's Kiss on hand, or, which I think that's what I use here, or be able to use Toad. And I think on your Black Mage, at least if it's like all the other Final Fantasies ever, on your Black Mage, if you're a Toad, you're still able to cast Toad. That'll be the only spell that you'll be able to use, but you will be able to cast Toad to cure yourself of Toad. So that's it. Pretty quick fight. There's a little bit more to it coming up. There's some kind of story elements and pieces, but that's the bulk of it right there. If you can beat that piece, you should be able to beat all the rest of them as well. So, Badass Mage shows up to save the day. The Mask. This is supposed to be kind of a touching moment here of him kind of reuniting with his mom, but I do have to say, I really didn't care that much when I got to this point. Like, I wasn't very invested in the character of Eduardo. I think part of that problem, the problem there is that he spent most of his time in your party as a toad. Not only that, but he didn't spend very much time with your party. It wasn't like Barbara. And with Barbara, I felt a little more attached. There was more going on. And so when her story elements came up, I was a little more interested in it. You know, I was reading the dialogue with a little more sincerity. Sucker punch. So you get to do it again, only this time she takes off her clothes. Quite literally. Like, I'm not joking, she takes off her clothes here. She goes into full form. That's not my true form. My true form is half naked. And there you go. Because if video games have taught us anything, it's that women with less clothes on are more powerful. I always love that about video games. It's like you have these guys with these bulking, huge pieces of armor, right? And then girls wear like this armored bikini, and it's like, really, you're not even trying. What are you doing? You just did the opposite of what you were trying to do. That's bad. Like why didn't she just leave her robe on? Maybe she needed her wing things undone or something? Maybe she's got magic knee pads. Yeah, this is very bizarre. Kind of reminds me a lot. Kotaku, I'm not sure if how many people out there read Kotaku, but they it's a blog on video games. I would assume most people are at least aware of it, but they do a lot of pieces on sexism in video games. And I'd have to say, for me, most of the time, I think it's way overblown. But I think it's one of those things where it's like, very clearly there's sexism in video games. The example that I just brought up, that's a great example. There's sexism in video games because of that. Just that is enough to say that there's obviously a problem there. That doesn't mean that we need to beat it with a stick. I think that there's much more productive things we can do than simply saying things are sexist when they're not really. For instance, the PlayStation convention that just recently had happened, there was a lot of, I think it was including Kotaku, was saying that, oh, well, there was no female presenters. Well, there was like 4 presenters, and that's not sexist for them to not have a female presenter. There was a lot of other groups that didn't have presenters. I don't think there was a black guy that presented. So what, now they're racist, maybe none of them were gay, so now they're homophobic? So we can't really, I think that's blowing the sexism problem overboard. But I think making it real, or acknowledging that it's real, is an important piece. And I think that's what they're trying to do. They're just doing it with clout, so much with clout, that's the wrong word. They're using their clout and blowing it up, much like the National Enquirer would blow up a story, where maybe there's a nugget of truth somewhere in there, but it's just so flamboyant at that point that, it's almost laughable. I really think that they're just going for traffic, which, if that's the case, that shame on them, because there's clearly a real problem, and they're exploiting that problem for money, for views, which then turns into money. So I think that that's kind of the opposite of what we want to happen. What should be done is acknowledging where these real sexist elements are happening and judge games based on that. I think that when you have a game that has a real sexist element, like armored bikinis for women, that are like the legendary armor for the girl is extremely sexy. Well, that should be pointed out, and that game should be judged appropriately. Looks like I'm out of time here, though, so make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, this has been Pixel Freak.